political environment changed a whole lot. There was not, and this was living in the glory days. I mean, we didn't have oversight and a lot of bureaucracy. It was just go get the job done. We had a lot of support at all levels, and that made the job, I don't think we'd have gotten there, okay, with all the challenges we had if we hadn't had that environment to work in. As we moved into shuttle, the technology issues decreased, okay, but the other things continued to increase. And there's another thing that we had to do in shuttle. We had to keep the program sold. Apollo was sold, yeah, I guess it was, it was sold to the president. Really asked, can we do it? And then NASA says, yeah, we think we can do it. It's going to be high risk. And he said, go do it. Well, that was the end of the selling program. But now shuttle came along. It was the continuous selling to convince the administration and the Congress and the public that it was worth doing. This doesn't sound like engineering, but let me tell you what. If you don't do it, if the engineering group and the management doesn't do it, it's not going to get done. As I said, the president was in full support in Apollo. We did it. We sold it to the White House. We had fragmented political support in the shuttle program, and it was a tight schedule. We had a lot of variability in the budget, and we had a whole lot more bureaucracy. This not having that would let the Apollo program focus on what they were doing on the technology. I think I mentioned the shuttle, the major development there. The whole list in Apollo was so great, it was unbelievable. Literally, we didn't know what we didn't know, which was good. In shuttle, we had some major developments. In propulsion systems was a major development, especially with the SSMEs and a lot of stuff. And Jody will talk about that. Thermal protection system, fully reusable. Apollo was throwaway. We used it one time, so that was a big technology issue. The avionics was big, and the reusability of the vehicle. Those were our four major technology challenges. The rest of it, we pretty well knew, okay? But then we had to balance it between something that's a single event and go into something that's routine ops. And then John O'Neill will talk more about that. Not an issue in keeping the program sold in Apollo. Shuttle, it was a continuous challenge. The thing that one of the big differences in between Apollo and shuttle was Apollo had things happening all the time. I mean, there were launches and there were failures and there were events. The public could see it. It was exciting to everybody. In shuttle, this thing drug along for a long time. I mean, we in the program felt great about it because we were making a lot of progress. We were having design reviews and, things were coming about. We were doing subsystem tests and they were working well. But nobody saw that it wasn't exciting. We didn't have any gee whiz. Until 78, I think, is when we did the approach and landing test. Is that right, John? About 78? Yeah. That was a gee whiz. Okay, that was not in the program initially, but when we saw that orbiter on the back of the 747, it was a good engineering management test objective, but the biggest thing was it was a visible thing that got the excitement. The next step in the shuttle program, it was about to get canceled, literally. We were right on the verge of that program dying. But when that happened, all of a sudden was, get that thing in space. The early formulation, let me talk about some of the things that we did in the shuttle to get to where we did. Our requirements in the shuttle, we had to have an Earth-to-orbit transportation system. We knew we had multi-year budgets that we had to look at and consider how to. That means, do we front load this thing and do a lot of development at the front, or do we have a flat line budget? Well, that doesn't work very well, so there's got to be a peak in it, but it depends on whether you put your focus on development or ops. And then we had to look at those development ops costs. We had all kinds of masses and sizes of payloads we had to deliver, different types of orbital objectives and missions. We looked at a fully reusable system, turnaround time was it, and cross range. So what did we do? We said, so we started in 69, but there's a 1970 version. We said, okay, this is going to be a reusable system. Let's look at fully reusable, a reusable booster and a reusable second stage. but we didn't have much cross range on it. So that was one solution. We were doing about a configuration a day, literally looking at these things, studying them at a very high-level parametric way. And we finally decided in about 72 that this is what the, see if I can hit this back. This is the configuration as you see it today, almost, okay, not quite. But that was the baseline configuration which we began the DD-TNE in 72. So we studied in phase A and B, when you define a program, it's kind of a rule of thumb that's worked very well in the past. If you spend about 3% of what you think the program is going to cost on defining it, that's about the right magnitude. That's what we did on shuttle, that's what we did on space station, and then you know you've got something that you can accomplish. Yeah, there are a lot of hiccups that you're going to have to encounter, but that'll come about. And then we had to balance between the development and operations cost. And that was the big ditty. So we had to throw away the tank, because we couldn't do that fully reusable system. Just the money wasn't there. The thing is, we did not change the configuration. Shuttle didn't change the configuration. Apollo didn't. Shuttle and the orbiter, which I spent a lot of my life on, we started off with a $5 billion program. We developed the vehicle for $5 billion, exactly what we said. But we said, okay, we're going to hold the configuration, but in about 70, 75 or something like that, we had to make some changes. But we changed the program content. Let me give you an example. When we started the program, there was a full thermal vacuum test of the forward fuselage of the orbiter. All systems in it. Crew module, all the avionics, everything else. We're going to do a thermal vacuum test. Same thing on the aft end. We had a full thermal vacuum test. All the propulsion system and everything else was going to be there. What we did was we said, we're going to have to eliminate those things. But we eliminated them very, very carefully. We knew we could accomplish the mission. We would have to gracefully grow into it by not having those full thermal vacuum tests. We convinced ourselves we could do it analytically, but we had to start flying the missions very benign, as benign thermally as we could. We had 2 full orbiter airframes. That's on a 747, L-1011, those kinds of aircraft at the time. They always have a dedicated static test article and a fatigue test article. We started the program with a fully dedicated 2 airframes for static and fatigue tests. We ended up with none, okay? We tested the Challenger airframe. That was a vehicle, came off the assembly line. We took it, we tested it to 120% of mechanical loads. We pre-predicted every single strain gauge on that vehicle, 3,000 strain gauges. We said, as we start loading it, this is the way it's going to respond. And if we can do that, then we understand what we have. So lo and behold, we got it there. We put a pretty good load on it, 120% load, mechanically. We combined the thermal stress with it, which was not insignificant. We said we're ready to fly. So that saved $100 million in the program, which we got $100 million cut that year. We said we got to save $100 million. So we scratched our head and said, okay, we think we can do that. So there was our test article. Crew module is not in this part. Loading jacks went in that. We pull this off, stuck the crew module in there, and put some tiles on it and flew it. That's oversimplified. But that was the Challenger airframe, and we saved that amount. Now, we didn't do that easily. The administrator says, oops, I don't trust you guys. So we had all these outside guys come in and grade our paper, and they said, well, these guys, we think they know what they're doing. On the simplifying the interfaces, there was, as we began the development of the shuttle, at the JSC, Marshall had the responsibility of the payloads, and we said, okay, tell us what payloads to put in this sucker. Now, this was in 1972. They didn't have any idea, So we said, they don't know, we don't know. So what we did is we looked at all kinds of variations in payload configurations. From mass, multiple payloads, CGF, CG forward, everything you can do. We had 10 million combinations of things. We did a Monte Carlo. We designed the mid-fuselage in 73 to exact that Monte Carlo thing. We didn't know where it was going to go, so we put sliding bridges in the vehicle to accommodate that flexibility. So what we did, we decoupled the orbiter design from the payload design. We also put a statically determinate system in there for you non-structural guys. That means it didn't matter what the stiffness of the orbiter was compared to the stiffness of payload. If you couple them too much, then you have to do an integrated loads. And we said, we can't do that, okay? So we simplified that interface. In the crew cabin, we had it float. It's attached at hard points. It's a pressure vessel sitting inside the forward fuselage of the orbiter. We did that so we could separate the loading in that cabin so it's designed for nothing except pressure and a little bit of inertia loads. We want to keep that simple because that was a highly critical area. We had a clog in part of the fuel cell system. We got debris in the line. We had to shut down one of the 3 fuel cells. We completed the mission. So we got back on the ground and we said, okay, we know what to do. We'll put a filter in there. We keep that material from going down and clogging the line. Well, 1 filter is good and that would do it, but 2 filters is obviously better, okay? So if you put 2 filters in, now you really got a good system. Wrong. Because what we did, we trapped hydrogen gas between those 2 filters. We collected the hydrogen gas in the tank, in the ullage tank. We could have blown up the vehicle like that. So, if you have something that works, stop, okay? You don't have to keep going. So this was one of the examples of just better's enemy of good, and that was the placard we had in the project office. Better's enemy of good, and it paid off. And the last thing I'd say is get a successful team. I said it was a real honor and a privilege in going through all the phases of the shuttle program, and it was another asset. Let me put it in that term. We never changed the team. That team stayed in place the entire time, from John Yardley all the way down to a grunt like myself. Okay, we kept the same guys in there. So Alan Lovelace, he said, what I'm going to do, shortly before the flight, he was concerned that we weren't going to get there and we weren't committed enough. So he said, I want you guys to tell me that you're committed to get this vehicle flying. So he said, let me tell you a story. He said, to have a good breakfast, the pig really has to commit. Chicken kind of participates, but the pig commits. And I want you guys to tell me you're committed to do it. So we said, yay, Valerie, we're committed. So he formed the Ham and Egg Society. It still exists. A lot of the guys that you see up there are not there anymore. So hopefully on the last shuttle flight, we'll have a reunion. This was after the STS-1. We all met. We had a meeting down here, okay? And so we met. So hopefully we can do that again for our team on the last shuttle flight and come down and stand on the beach and watch it go.